Wonderful. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Happy Hanukkah. I see some folks already dropping where they are in the chat, but I would love it if you would maybe introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining us from in the chat. And as is my tradition, if you could also maybe share something that really jumped out at you from the Daf this week, that would be fantastic. And while you are doing that, I will, oh, hi, everyone. I will start talking about what we did this week. So we started this week's Daf with a weird series of stories about Bar Kapara and Rabbi Judah Hanasi. And then we shifted to talking about the food cooked in various kinds of dishes, the foods cooked using different methods, dairy products, wine, what I think the author of the essay on one of those days' dafs called derivatives, relationships of produce to the kinds of food that they produce. And then we sort of shifted to this really interesting conversation about the way that language is so fundamentally local, that what words mean depends on the communities that use them. And then we shifted, we finished one chapter, we started another chapter. We asked the classic question, which science has now answered, are gourds vegetables? Yes, Brenda, when I'm talking about language as local, what I'm talking about there is the discussion about dag and daga, the different words for fish and how they mean different things in different biblical passages. What that gets the rabbis talking about is, well, maybe in one community it means one thing and in another community it means something else. And so when we're trying to analyze someone's vows, we kind of need to know, who is their community, so that we understand what they intended. And then so after we had all of those discussions, and then we did are gourds vegetables? Spoiler alert, they're not, they're fruit. Then we asked about, we got that great story about Rava and Altalta, right? What on earth is this thing? And this very evocative fight between Rava and his teacher, Rav Yosef. And then we shifted to talking about people who vow about different kinds of clothing, not to wear particular kinds of clothing, and what does that actually mean in terms of the different kinds of clothing that you might wear. And then we ended with this really great discussion about the sabbatical onion, which I just sort of I like as a phrase. So lots of into the weeds, right? Lots of into the weeds. But what I want to do with us in the next, 25 minutes is take a gigantic step back and ask a question that I imagine many of you are asking as you move your way through Nedarim, which is, why the heck are people making so many vows? Right? What on earth are folks doing? Especially now that we've seen just how complicated it is. So I want to share my screen and I want to look at a couple of places in this week's Daf where we actually kind of got a hint at what might be going on. So let me share my screen. Okay. So can you see my PowerPoint? Is that what you're seeing? Yes. Thank you. Amazing. So we get this Mishnah on Nedarim 55b, and I brought the Hebrew, but I'm just going to read it in the English. Rabbi Yehuda says, everything is determined according to the one who vows. If one was bearing a burden of wool and linen and was sweating, and its smell was unpleasant for him, and he said, wool and linen are konam for me, and I will therefore not place them upon myself, it is permitted for him to cover himself with wool and linen garments, but it is prohibited for him to sling them over his shoulder behind him as a burden. So can I get somebody maybe in the chat just to remind us about what the word konam means? Anyone remember what the word konam means? Yes, Rob, fantastic. Right. Rob tells us forbidden like a korban. It's forbidden like a temple sacrifice is forbidden to be, eaten and used if you're not a priest who is eating and using the sacrifice. Amazing. Wonderful. So according to this Mishnah, why might somebody make a vow not to, right, that wool and linen are konam to them? I know it's participatory, it's early. Some of you are probably right now under wind and snow watches. I'm so grateful you're joining us. Looking at this Mishnah, can anybody maybe jump in? You can raise your hand or you can put something in the chat. Why, according to this Mishnah, might somebody vow not to deal with wool and linen? I've stumped you. That's okay. This is a safe space. Allergies.
They just sound annoyed.
What?
This person sounds annoyed. I mean,
Yeah.
raw wool does not smell pleasant, even without all the sweating.
Yeah, right? Like something is happening. It's bugging you. And so you're being very dramatic and being like, I will never engage with that thing again. Right? It's sweaty. It's stinky. And you're just like, I'm done. Okay, let's look at the Gemara, right? So the Talmud on that discussion brings us an earlier tradition, which gives us some other examples of this. So it's taught in a Braita. In what circumstances did Rabbi Yehuda say everything is according to the one who vows? Great question. If one was wearing a woolen garment and it caused him discomfort, and in reaction he said, wool is konam for me and I will not place it on myself, it is prohibited for him to wear woolen garments, but it is permitted to place a burden of woolen garments upon him. If you were burdened with flax and sweating and you said flax is konam for me and I will not place it upon myself, it is permitted for him to wear flax and it is prohibited for him to place a burden on him. Great points, right? And so, Philip, what you're pointing out when you note in the chat that it's not clear if this refers to carrying versus wearing is that depending on what the item is, we interpret the words differently. But I think if we just take that step back, we can see, right, in one example, it causes him discomfort, right? Wool can be itchy, right? Some of us are currently under a winter storm watch. You might be bundled up, and let's be honest, wool can be itchy. Or if you're holding flax and it is making you sweat, you might just get really annoyed and go, oh, can't. Totally just can't, never again. Okay, so that's what the Gemara argues that, Rob, that's a great point. Rob points out in the chat that wool might be a metonym for all animal-based clothing and flax might be a metonym for all plant-based clothing. Now, that's not 100% clear, and there is a series of debates about what exactly is meant when we talk about wool and flax. But for now, what I really want to focus on is, the way that the Talmud presents somebody making a vow being a result of being annoyed. But I want to offer us another piece of context that might help us understand why people might want to make vows, right? And I'm not saying because they're annoyed isn't one of the reasons, but I think, many of us have been annoyed about things and not made vows to avoid those things forever. So thinking about the context in which that kind of response might make sense. Okay, so here I'm going to get real nerdy for a minute. Get excited. So there's this academic concept called asceticism. Asceticism is a concept that means essentially to deny or restrict particular things in your life as part of a broader religious or spiritual practice. So the classic article on asceticism in rabbinic literature was written by Dr. Stephen Fraud, who ironically is totally not the right verb, but coincidentally was Dr. Scheinerman and my teacher at Yale. And Dr. Fraud writes, there is a tension inherent in all religious systems. Humans, whether individually or collectively, aspire to advance ever closer to an ideal of spiritual fulfillment and, that should read, perfection, while confronting a self and a world that continually set obstacles in that path. Ooh, boy, I did not type correctly. How can one proceed along that path with a whole, undivided, undistracted heart, meaning all one's energies and intentions, while living among the distractions of the present world? Right? This is an idea that we see in all kinds of religious traditions, right? I want to spend my time focusing on reading Talmud, but, I have to eat, I have to, drink, I have to put on moisturizer because it's really dry out, right? I've got to do all of these things that take care of my body, which are reminders that my body is complicated and can get in the way of doing the thing I want to be doing, which is bringing me to a connection with God. I saw a hand and then it disappeared. Was there a question? Okay, I guess.
Sorry, I didn't see it. I didn't notice.
Yeah, I'm guessing somebody accidentally hit a button, and that's okay. This is a safe space to accidentally hit a button. So the idea of asceticism is one that actually, we all are familiar with in the world today. This isn't only an ancient practice. So the classic example of this might be Yom Kippur, right? Yom Kippur, where you are avoiding sort of the physical so that you can spend a very intense day focusing on the spiritual, right? You're spending a day in shul or in synagogue. You are not worrying about what you're going to eat for lunch. You are really, right? It's not just a question of being miserable or denying yourself things. It's a question of using the time and energy that you would spend preparing those things or doing those things for a higher purpose. Now, as I'm seeing a couple of folks note in the chat, right, Carol, I love this point. Sometimes mundane distractions intensify our spiritual goals rather than deterring them, right? This doesn't always work. And I'm also seeing some folks in the chat say, hey, should this even work? Is this the way we should be doing things? I love that. So I think it's worth noting that this is happening all around the rabbis of the Talmud all the time, both in the culture of Roman Palestine, where the Mishnah was written, and in Sasanian Babylonia, right? This is a very exciting ascetic moment in the ancient world. So we have early Christians are developing monasteries and monks and vows of various kinds, denying things. We have in Sasanian Babylonia, these religious traditions that you may or may not have ever heard of, Mandeans and Manichaeans, who also have really strong ascetic vibes. But this isn't something that the rabbis are getting from somewhere else, because in Judaism, from the earliest days of Judaism, we have seen both strong ascetic tendencies and strong non-ascetic tendencies, right? Thinking, let's say here, about vows versus blessings over food, right? Which certainly seems to be sanctifying food in a way that honors the role of eating delicious food in our connection to God. Rob pointed out in the chat, Hidur mitzvah, this concept of take a mitzvah, take a commandment and make it even more elaborate, more beautiful as a way to connect it to God, could involve, having a really nice Shabbos meal, right? Which seems to pull against this tendency. But this idea is, right, asceticism is something that is all around the rabbis of the Talmud. It is earlier in Jewish traditions around Philo and some of the Second Temple sects. And it continues to be one voice among many in rabbinic literature. And I think those of you who are like, wow, this doesn't sound like the Judaism I know, what you're pointing out is, depending on your Jewish community, you might have a stronger ascetic impulse or a weaker ascetic impulse. But both of those sort of, right, at this point in our journey through the Daf, we know, right, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So the rabbis are going to have a lot of different takes on this. So that's what I wanted to sort of offer us, right, as this giant step back and saying, why might people be vowing, I'm never going to eat this kind of food again. I'm never going to wear this kind of clothes again. And I think it's worth saying, in the Talmud, it sounds like it's coming out of frustration. But I get frustrated a lot, and I never vow not to wear a particular kind of clothing. So we have to imagine, well, what kind of world did the rabbis live in where, when you're frustrated, making a vow to avoid a thing forever kind of makes sense? So I'm curious, with that information, what might that tell us about this whole concept of Nedarim? Now that we have this context, I'm curious, what do you think about how the rabbis imagine all of the vows people might be making? And Rachel, if you could maybe be in charge of seeing hands and unmuting, I'd love to just have a discussion about it, because so many of you have messaged me or emailed me and been like, why are they vowing? So now that we have some more context, what do you think the answer is?
We also had a memorable vow a few weeks ago where a father gets very angry and disinherits a child, right? And I think the discussion there was, the language was, my property, you cannot benefit. My property is konam for you. And then the question was, does that extend to the child's inheritance or not? Like, is that for the lifetime of the parent, or is that for the full time? Yes. Okay. We've got a hand up. So, Stephen, sorry.
Yes, I want to make the point, as I think I did in the chat a short time ago, that for the people in the times of the Talmud and earlier, as Dr. Rose just discussed, religion and the connection to God was a much greater part of people's lives than it is for us now. Everything, except for people like you, Dr. Scheinman, or Dr. Ronis, who work full time at religion. But for most of us, religion is a part of our lives, an important part, but it's only a part of our lives. To the people in these communities in Persia or in the Eretz Israel, or for that matter, people in the shtetls in medieval Europe centuries later, religion was the central part of their lives. So everything they did and everything they felt, and just about everything they thought, everything they ate, related to the religion. And the natural thing would be, if they wanted to do consume something or not consume, or the point, not consume something, that it would be that their decision to do so would be expressed in the form of a vow to the divine, a vow to Hashem.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a really important point, right? If religion is a really big part of your life, then when you have problems, you might use religion as part of the solution. Now, I do want to say, I actually think some folks in this room maybe grew up in communities or are currently in communities where actually religion did all of that and does all of that still. So, it's kind of interesting to think about. I think you're right. Many people don't think about religion as a 24/7 thing. But I think many folks, Jews and people of other religions, actually do. And it does still shape what they eat and what they wear and which shoe they put on first in the morning in ways that might be similar, not similar to the Talmud in what they're doing, but in that sort of total religious immersion. But I think you're right. For a lot of us for whom that's not the case, this is just not where our brains would go. Absolutely.
And the rabbis knew people for whom that was not the case too.
Yeah.
Right? That's sort of what the category of Amei Haaretz is all about, right? People who are just less fastidious and less thinking about it all the time.
Yeah. Which on the one hand sounds, a little more relaxing. And on the other hand, you're missing out on the wealth of Talmudic discourse. So you win some, you lose some. Linda, I saw your hand.
Let me bring Linda in. Thank you, Stephen. Oh, Linda, we still can't hear you. Though it does not appear you're on mute, so I'm not sure. That's not just me, right?
No, it's not just you. If I had to guess, I would guess that your microphone is off, unrelated to Zoom.
Uh-huh.
So while you're figuring that out, I just don't want everybody to be like awkwardly staring at Linda. So let me just pull out some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat as responses. One is actually Linda pointing out that meditation is a great example of a Jewish ascetic practice today, right? Which ironically, right, and I love this point, Linda, ascetic practices where you downplay the body can actually be really good for the body sometimes, right? I think that's a really important point. Philip, I love your comment, right? This reminds me of my grandchildren. I will never eat liver again, right? Something you don't like, there's this strong
I'm
response.
with Philip's grandchildren.
What?
I'm with Philip's grandchildren.
Fair. As someone who loves me some chopped liver, I would never make that vow. But, you could imagine a world in which Philip's grandchildren lived where vows were how people expressed things, making such a vow. And ideally, if they were under the age of bar or bat mitzvah, it would be annulled when they got older, right? They could one day enjoy the beauty of chopped liver. I see one more comment and then we'll circle back to Linda and then I see another hand.
Yeah, we've got Mary here.
Great. Which is
Mary Jane.
Mary Jane.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. I remember a story from a couple of weeks ago about a young man who saw a reflection of himself in the pond. And he was so taken with his beauty. He had beautiful curly hair. Mm-hmm. And he worried that he was going to become narcissist and arrogant. So he vowed to be a Nazir. And that way, at the end of his Nazirite year, he was going to have to shave off his hair. So he did this truly as a way of being closer to God, of humbling himself. And I can see vows like that we could do. If we find we're buying too much stuff and putting it in the house, we can vow not to spend more than $10 a month on stuff. I mean, whatever. There are things that can help you tone down the things of the world and connect yourself closer.
Absolutely. What a wonderful parallel. And certainly I think for those for whom the Gregorian calendar is important, the idea of New Year's coming up and New Year's resolutions as a way to do that, I think anyone who's ever made a New Year's resolution knows, that you don't always do what you've resolved, but vows certainly have a lot more teeth, right? As a way to do that. Yeah. Linda, is your sound working? No, it is not. So Linda put in the chat that even Kabbalistic and Hasidic rabbis believe in this practice until today. And I think that is true. It is also true of various denominations of Judaism, right? Even going back to my example earlier about Yom Kippur, many Jews who wouldn't identify as Hasidic or Orthodox engage in ascetic practice on these particular heightened moments, right? Now, as several of you have also noted in the chat, the same kind of Judaism that mandates fasting on Yom Kippur for those who are physically able to also mandates enjoying, the holiday of Sukkot and other beautiful things that are delicious and feel good. So, right. I mean, you can say a lot of things about Yom Kippur, but it's not the most physically pleasurable of the holidays, where like, give me a good Passover Seder and I'm very full and slightly tipsy, right? Which is a different kind of physical feeling. So I definitely think we have a piece about that. And I saw Sylvia's comment in the chat too, which is living in a world without control under rule of the other. This is a way of taking control of your own life. And certainly, I think it's really important that we understand that in the ancient world, much, let's be honest, like today, we are not actually in control of everything around us. I think the world would be better if I was, but that's not the world we live in. And so figuring out where the spaces are where we do where we can take control, right? I might not be able to control whether or not wool makes me itchy, but I can control whether or not I wear it. I may not be able to control personally who is in the White House or sitting in the Canadian Parliament, but I can control when I'm going to be wearing particular kinds of clothes or eating particular kinds of things or sleeping in a particular kind of bed. And there's power in that. Now, we also don't want to have this illusion of control, right, where we're saying, well, I made a vow about beds, so now I don't have to vote, right? Like, that's not what I'm saying. I want to be very clear. But I do think it's really valuable for us just, in our last 2 minutes to recognize, on the one hand, as we're going through Nedarim, we can get really into the weeds, right? What does this word mean? Is a dog and a daga the same thing, or are there different names for different size fish? But on the other hand, this is part of a broader way of relating to the world for the rabbis and also for all the other communities that live around them at the time. So when things get rough, right, then this becomes an alternative or an option that makes religious sense to them. Brenda, I'm so sorry to hear that. So we have literally 1 minute left. We have time for maybe a question.
While we wait to see if anyone else has another comment, I've been thinking about this too as we go through this tractate, because vowing is not something we normally think of so much in our lives. And I think we're seeing a lot of different kinds of vows in this tractate. We've seen a lot of vows that are made in moments of emotion and frustration, anger, and this and that. And it seems like part of the tractate is all about the rabbis trying to remind people that those have serious legal and religious consequences and not to take it too casually. And then we've also seen vows that are made, like the vow of the young man who saw his reflection, that are made very intentionally.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I'm not sure there's a one size fits all for vowing, but it does seem to be something that everybody, whether deeply invested in the rabbinic system or more outside of it, seems to know and do in the ancient world.
Yeah, and I also think, the flip side of the rabbis telling us that there are consequences to doing it is they're also saying, and there's space for those feelings, right? Frustration has a rabbinic outlet. You want to be careful, but frustration isn't bad. It just has consequences. Anger isn't necessarily bad. It just has consequences. Even like thinking you look good in a mirror isn't bad. It just has consequences that you may or may not want. And you might choose a different path. And I think, asceticism might be one of those, like, you want to downplay, but it also is a way of saying, like, these feelings are legitimate and have a place. It might, that place just has a consequence. Yeah.
Though all things being equal, I think they wanted to get rid of vowing completely.
Oh,
they would have been really happy to just like not have these utterances, many of which were spur of the moment, have so much actual legal weight. You get the sense in the tractate that they are wrestling with that fact. They can't change that fact. The Torah says it's so, but you get the feeling that it frustrates them a little bit.
Absolutely. But like so many things that frustrate the rabbis, people do it anyways.
Yes.
Right. And so then they've also got to react to what other people are doing.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. It was, thank you, Dr. Ronas, for a very interesting discussion and putting our heads in the space of asceticism a little bit, because that's always an interesting discussion, and helping us step back and think more broadly about how vows might have operated on the ground for the rabbis and the people that they served. And thank you to all of you for all the comments and interesting insights. I always learn from you guys as well. And we'll see you in your inbox tomorrow. And we will see you in this space, I believe, next week. Not a secular holiday next Thursday. So I think we should be good to go. And happy Hanukkah, everybody.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Okay, bye.